Okay, today we're going to talk about a man who's forgotten. I'd say a prophet of Italian fascism is Enrico Corradini, who was very influential in the fascist movement beforehand and greatly had influenced Benito Mussolini and had been greatly influenced by Gabriele D'Annunzio, the poet, who would lead the first black shirts, the Arditi, on the March of Fiume, and stayed there for about a year until the Italian military, under orders of King Vittorio Emanuele III, had sent an ultimatum for D'Annunzio to leave the city of Fiume, and they actually attacked the city of Fiume, and then Gabriele D'Annunzio had the whole movement called off by force from the king. However, Enrico Corradini is very important because he's coming up with this idea of proletarian nationalism, a nationalism that is unique to Italy's case at the time and unique to Italian nationalism in general. Now, the two sources I'll be using for the life of Enrico, well, actually, the two documents dealing with Enrico Corradini's ideal of Italian nationalism and how it later influenced the fascist movement, was a book called The Fascist Experience in Italy by John Pollard. And it's from the Routledge Sources in History. A very cheap book with many documents, a short book, easy read. You could get it cheaply on eBay. And he is also quoting from another book called Italian Fascism from Pareto to Gentile, which has to deal with the whole, if you want, the prophets of Italian fascism, the prophets of the ideals of fascism before the fascist party came into being. So they'd be going into people like D'Annunzio, Georges Sorel, and Mussolini's revolutionary past, where he ultimately meets Niccolo Bombazzi, the later future fascist of the Italian Social Republic. But Enrico Corradini wrote a newspaper in 1903 called Il Rigano, and that lasted till 1905. Now, Enrico Corradini is very famously known for being a writer, a journalist, and a future senator under the Italian fascist regime. He's going to die in 1931, and sadly, the only film of him that I can find is a clip on YouTube about 1 minute and 3 seconds long of his funeral. And Enrico Corradini, since he was a writer, was greatly influenced by D'Annunzio, who was influenced by Nietzsche, but also was influenced by two currents that he had written against, that he had thought had really made a change in the new state, in the new desired national state of Italy since it's been unified. And that was the Libyan War, when the Kingdom of Italy had went to war with the Ottoman Empire over imperial land grabs and getting into the Great Game, which Italy had for most of the time sat out because it was not unified yet until 1870. And so the Libyan War greatly shapes him, and he wrote a book that sadly none of his work has been translated into English except the titles, that can be purchased in Italian on eBay. And there is a biography of Enrico Corradini written by a man named Gurio Benedetti. That's out there. Sadly, it's still not translated to English. None of his work is. But since he started a newspaper called, since of course El Rigano failed, and he established La Ideal Nazionale, I can't speak Italian sadly, called the National Ideal, and that was founded in around the time of the Italian war for Libya against the Ottoman Turks. And there's 4 books that I can find written by him. There are actually 5. One is Julius Caesar, a play in 5 acts that came out in 1929, translated into English, which I can't find for purchase. And then there's Italy's Desire, the Tripoli movement. These are the two books that came out around the time of the war with Libya, The Distant Fatherland, and The Distant War, which came around right during the war with Libya. And you could find his entire National Ideal newspaper as a book form. All the clippings and articles in that still not translated into English, sadly. But excuse me, I needed a drink. The most important thing is he founded a movement called the Italian Nationalist Association, and this is going to last from 1910 to 1923, when right after the 1921 election, it decided with many other conservative groups and monarchist groups to form into the one bloc called the National Fascist Party. So he's very influential, and the Italian National Association is going to bring in people like, not Giovanni Gentile, but Giovanni Gentile is going to know of it and read it, but greatly Alfredo Rocco, who's going to work on fascism's corporatist and economic policies in the near-distant future, Giovanni Papini, Pareto, even D'Annunzio, and Giuseppe Prezovini, and of course Benito Mussolini later on will have contacts with these people and even go to, as it says in the great book Revolutionary Fascism by Eric Norling, which is also a very good book. So let's get into the book The Fascist Experience in Italy by John Pollard. And I'm going to read the sections of his writings and what John Pollard has to say here, because he's giving kind of the context of what's going on. So, quote, "The Nationalist Challenge. The Libyan War had also failed to satisfy extremists of the right, particularly the nationalists, whose growing political influence and restlessness Golitti had hoped to check by means of his North African adventure." So I forgot to mention that one of the biggest problems Enrico Corradini had with Italy at the time was that the Giovanni Golitti government, which was a liberalist, center-conservative government, was so weak and backward, and in his view lacked any bones to bring Italy to a greater national ideal. And Enrico Corradini looks to the national ideal as Rome and the Mediterranean, and of course the Adriatic. And he called the Golitti Italy, the liberal Italy, Little Italy, because he saw Little Italy as Italy being put down by the liberal and conservative politicians, the conservatives, and as well as the socialist and revolutionary forces that was transforming Italy, and that there wasn't really a nationalist group to really fight them back. Of course, the fascists will be that group to fight them. And then also the church. Not the church as the spiritual body of Christ, but the institution. The Catholic Church at this time is going to be in great confrontation with the Kingdom of Italy over its lands, its power, its political influence, and even its financial needs, which is going to be solved by the fascist regime in 1929 with the Lateran Pact. So, back to the book. The Nationalists were a tiny minority movement, but a vocal and influential one in the circles of high politics. Their chief ideologue was Enrico Corradini, who represented those who regretted the failure of Francisco Crispi's colonial adventures in Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, who were ashamed that Italy's economic weakness obliged millions of her sons and daughters to seek a living elsewhere, and who thus felt a deep national inferiority complex. The following passage demonstrates very clearly the dissatisfaction of Corradini and his followers with Italia, the Little Italy as they saw it of the Goliottian period. End quote. So, a little context on Francisco Crispi. He was a conservative, greatly influenced by Giuseppe Mazzini, and got elected to government and wanted to expand Italy's what he saw as its national destiny. And he did that by getting into Eritrea and Somalia, and then into Ethiopia, And then you had the Battle of Ottawa, which went horrible and became always a set of huge national embarrassment. So now we're going to get into Enrico Corradini, his actual writings here. And this is called Proletarian Nations and Nationalism, 1911. Quote, "We must seek rather to discover the causes for Italy, not possessing any developed national awareness, and start straight away by recognizing that she does not possess. One, because she cannot. And here are the reasons why she cannot. First of all, gentlemen, until quite recently, Italy had in fact never been a nation. Second, Italy has never had and still does not have a national language, except in literature. Thirdly, she was created after little fighting and little revolution. Fourthly, Italy was created as a result of the efforts of too many people, often in conflict among themselves, an official aristocratic and middle-class monarchy, popular Giuseppe Garibaldiism, cosmopolitan Giuseppe Mazziniism, and these conflicts persisted and still persist. Fifthly, Italy was created as a result of diplomatic intrigues and by foreign armies. Sixthly, Italy too quickly declined into class struggle and the initial formation of her self-awareness was inhibited. Seventh and lastly, Italy, and this could not be otherwise because of the slightness of the revolution that created her, Italy fell into the hands of politicians whom I have already described more closely above, the dregs of tradition, methods and people already decadent and decaying under a regime of tiny, timorous government. Tumorous government. My apologies. End quote. So, I would say he did a good job in laying out what was really going on in Italy and what made liberal Italy such a weak state. Weak. Okay, so this is what John Pollard says. The critique of the struggles for independence... Oh, by the way, John Pollard, who wrote the book, The Fascist Experience in Italy, is not a fan of Italian fascism. In fact, he's a liberal, and he makes some very interesting claims here that in many cases I would disagree with. But let's go on back to the book. The critique of the struggles for independence and unity during the Risorgimento and of the men who led those struggles is close to the revisionist interpretation of the Risorgimento. All it lacks is an explanation of Italy's weakness on the international plane. Her role as the least of the great powers is an analysis of her economic backwardness. In point 6, Corradini points the finger at the main nationalist enemy and bugbear, international socialism. Socialism, with its emphasis on class consciousness and its theory and practice of class struggle, undermined the creation of a strong national consciousness as a preparation of the Italian people for struggle on the international plane. Point 7 reveals the essence of the nationalist critique, both of the Italian political system, parliamentary government, and the politicians who ran it, chief of whom was Gallotti, who in nationalist eyes embodied all the weakness and failings of politicians. Corradini's cure for the ills of Little Italy was the application of Marx's ideal of class struggle to the relations between nations, as set out in the speech which he made in 1910. End quote. So, you could just go read the book Revolutionary Fascism. Both Niccolò Babazzi, which, by the way, Culture Thug did a great video on Niccolò Babazzi, and Benito Mussolini both split from socialism because of that it was international, that it was more about the class struggle inside the nation than actually having the ideal of, wait a second, unification of the class for the struggle within the international plane. That they didn't have any conception of any national beliefs, that, borders are just made-man lines. Borders are arbitrary. They don't really exist. That's where Enrico Corradini was total bullshit. And that the problem with the Italian liberal state was that it didn't have its sense of nationalism really didn't exist. It was more about its own decadent materialistic wealth, which again it still lacked because again it didn't really help the Italian economy to move forward. And of course, being least of the great powers, that was a spot which, of course, could endanger Italy's future in the next century to come. So, let's get into our last writing from Enrico Corradini here, called The Principles of Nationalism, also written in 1911 when the war in Libya was going on. Quote, "We must start by recognizing that there are proletarian nations as well as proletarian classes. That is to say, there are nations whose living conditions are subject to great disadvantage to the way of life of other nations, just as classes are. Once this is realized, nationalism must, above all, insist firmly on this truth. Italy is materially and morally a proletarian nation. What is more, she is proletarian at a period before her recovery. That is to say, before she is organized, at a period when she is still groping and weak. And being subjected to other nations, she is weak not in the strength of her people, but in her strength as a nation. Exactly like the proletariat before socialism came to its aid, and just as socialism taught the proletariat the value of class struggle, we must teach Italy the value of international class struggle. But international class struggle means war. Well, let it be war, and let nationalism arise in Italy, the will to win a war." End quote. So, I think what's very interesting in this document is that Corradini is espousing the idea that, wait a second, it's not us as a people that's a problem, we're just not unified. We're lacking unification, which of course the fascists are going to say, and they're going to make that their symbol, the fasces, together, a bundle of sticks, united together to show strength of unity through strength. And of course they asked for willpower, justice and law, and violence. Violence in, of course, self-defense, and even for right causes. So let's get into what John Pollard says. "The international class struggle of the proletarian Italian nation would of course be directed against the bureaucratic powers, that is, Britain and France principally, because the logic of Italian imperialism demanded that apart from Ethiopia, colonies could only be acquired from the empires of those powers. And this logic was reinforced by the emphasis of Corradini and the nationalists on the inspiring myth of Rome, the need to recreate the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Conversely, Italy needed to strengthen her links with her friends in the Triple Alliance, Germany and Austria-Hungary, with the result that one of the most cherished aspirations of the nationalists, identitarianism from the Italian unredeemed lands, the desire to liberate the Italian-speaking territories inside the Habsburg Empire, would have to be put on ice. The nationalism of Corradini and others such as Alfredo Rocco, who first advocated a corporatist solution to the problems of relations between classes, was only a part of a much larger revolt against the prevailing political class and its rational, liberal conservative ideas and policies in the period leading up to the First World War. This result took a largely cultural form. It was carried on, for example, in the columns of numerous literary reviews, such as Corradini's own journal, Il Regno, and in literature of the period. Gabriele D'Annunzio, while remaining political aloof, shared many of Corradini's ideas, and in more extreme form. D'Annunzio's poetry and prose contained lyrical exaltations of patriotism and war, all couched in a religious imagery. But as Adrian Litton has pointed out, the ethic of D'Annunzio was Nietzschean and Darwinian, not Christian. The dictates of the heroic will are the highest law, and the conflict is the essence of civilization. And that's from the book Italian Fascism, from Parietal to Gentile. So back to the book. An even more radical rejection of existing values was offered by the most avant-gardist of all cultural movements in Italy before the First World War, the Futurists. Okay, so that's getting into the Futurists here, who are actually going to, when the socialists attack Mussolini, they're going to be the first people to come to his aid. So that's all I have to do here for Enrico Corradini. Sadly, there's not very much of his work translated into English. He's hardly even known about. And many fascists actually forget about him. But Enrico Corradini is very important because I would say for three main reasons. One is he's both reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary. And it shows that fascism, when it arose, was both. It was reactionary and revolutionary. Its revolutionary, yes, was reactionary, and vice versa. The second would be that, again, he would come back later on. His ideals would come back later on within the Italian Social Republic. And thirdly, he's a prophet. He's one of the prophets of fascism. Everyone knows D'Annunzio, but no one knows Enrico Corradini, who sadly there isn't any work on him in English. Nothing's been translated. And many of the other fascists out there don't speak of him. They don't know him. They don't understand his thought. And of course, we only have two documents from him from John Pollard's book, which is very sad. Sadly, I don't have Italian Fascism from Pareto to Gentile. Though I'm going to get that book, and I might revisit Enrico Corradini, depending if I pick up one of his books, or if I pick up Pareto to Gentile. Maybe I might learn Italian and translate some of his works, so they become well known for fascists in the future. But there is just one little quick thing I could say on him. This is what John Pollard has to say about the Roman Empire view here. The concept of destiny, quote, the concept of destiny is also clearly influenced by Corradini's ideal of the international class struggle of the proletarian and plutocratic nations, end quote. And, this is very interesting. Quote, this episode also demonstrates that Mussolini and fascists drew their ideas from a wide variety of sources, both Italian and foreign. Corradini, Rocco, Marinetti, Pareto, and Gentile, Nietzsche, Le Bon, and Georges Sorel, and in the case of racialism, primary German National Socialism. Yet, if Italian fascism in the 30s had developed a long way from the simplicity of its original ideals, then it has to be said that the later elaborations were usually a logical progression. In other words, the later ideas were latent in the thinking of the movement from the beginning. In this respect, only the introduction of racialism can be regarded as a radical departure from the ideas of the early fascist movement, which, end quote, which Enrico Corradini doesn't really go into race. Again, it's the proletarian versus the plutocratic nations, as we read, and Mussolini in the future is going to say, especially in the Italian Social Republic, that the liberals are the biggest liars and hypocrites. They're more totalitarian than the fascists are. Because the difference is the liberals really like to change culture through capitalism, through leftist ideas, and that if Italy had to choose between those two, the best it should do is choose the proletarian. Because the proletarian is more nationalist, will protect the traditions, and is able to deal with the class struggle differently. Though, of course, the fascists were very different on that. So that's Enrico Corradini. I'm going to be posting sources to buy the books, both The Fascist Experience in Italy by John Pollard, Italian Fascism from Pareto to Gentile, Revolutionary Fascism, and yes, his Wikipedia page. Also, there's another internet page, and finally, the film of Enrico Corradini's funeral, who died in 1931, who was a senator in the National Fascist Party. So thank you for listening. And that's all.